And the topic is the Chinese Cold War, which again is about as broad as one can get. We'll go in a lot of places, no doubt, and we'll just start right here. Okay.
Hello everyone, I'm Simon. Originally from Hong Kong, I work for a newspaper called the Apple Daily, but unfortunately the newspaper was shut down by the Communist Party, so now here I am in the United States. So long story short, if there's one message I want to convey today about the new Cold War with China is the Chinese Communist Party is just like any other regimes. Whatever it does to stay in power. And we should look at the new Cold War in that perspective. Especially for the Communist China, what really keeps the elite awake at night was the collapse of the Soviet Empire in 1991. And subsequently, the wave of democratic institutional change across Asia, first in Taiwan and South Korea, and then all the way to Central Asia. And later on, the CCP and Russia under Putin coined the term, the color revolution, for all those changes. And so I think that is the backdrop of what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. Firstly, it wants to stay in power, and secondly, it wants to keep the Western so-called influence out from Asia and then at best like eradicate it totally. And the strategy was to build an alliance with all the authoritarian regimes, especially to fill up the vacuum that was used to be influenced by the Soviets. So if you look at the Belt and Road Initiative, it was about filling up the vacuum left by the Soviet Empire. If you look at the alliance that is tried to build with the Global South, it was an attempt to justify the way for the less developed nations to remain authoritarians. I think that is what is going on here. And another thing about Cold War is it is a term coined by George Orwell in 1945 after he witnessed the atomic bomb in Hiroshima. And he was like, wow, this is going to change international politics because nuclear powers cannot completely conquer each other. So that will ends up in a perpetual, never-ending war. So the Cold War never ended. It's just changed from the Soviet to the U.S. with now China with the U.S. And when George Orwell wrote 1984, it was not a reminder to people behind the Iron Curtain. It was for the people living in the free world to remind us that the Cold War is coming and we have the potential of becoming one of them, becoming one of the totalitarian regimes. So if there's one message I have for the people here today, that is we might be unknowingly becoming one of those totalitarian regimes also when we are fighting against them. So I will just leave it here to other speakers and then we might talk about that later on.
Thank you. I'm Candice Pierucci. I serve in the Utah House of Representatives, and I've been in for 4.5 years now. I've run our legislation we had 2 Confucius Institutes at our major universities in Utah, so I ran the legislation to close both of those and prohibit it. Also, I ran legislation to close excuse me. I'm getting a cold from this room. It's freezing. To close the Confucius classroom that we had at one school district getting $500,000 from the CCP every year. And when I met with them to question that they were taking this money and the bill that I was running, they said, well, they don't have any requirements. And I said, so can your teachers teach about Tiananmen Square? They said, absolutely not. We don't talk politics. I was like, okay, I think they're sterilizing your curriculum here. So anyways, we were able to close that. I also, in Utah code, there was a gap that if you lobbied on behalf of a foreign government, you didn't have to register as a lobbyist. So I passed that bill as well. And then most recently passed the bill that the CCP and its military subsidiaries are unable to purchase land in Utah, and I'm working on a bill to expand that as well. So I've got a few bills in the hopper that I'm trying to work on, but I think I'm here as a legislator. If I can convey anything, it's that China definitely has a subnational strategy, and that they found that Congress gets intelligence briefings regularly, right? And that they are aware of international politics. At the state level, we don't get that at all. Most of us were a citizen legislature. You come in your first day and you have 0 staff, and they're very aware of that. And so one of the bills that I've been running for 3 years now is that you need to disclose when a foreign government pays for a trip for you. It doesn't say you can't take it, it just says you need to disclose it. There are more seasoned legislators in our body who have been to China 17 times, paid for by the Chinese Communist Party. So it impacts votes and politics, absolutely. So I think there are things we can do to shed light on this. I think transparency is a really great solution for a lot of the challenges we're having at the state levels. But unfortunately, Congress's inability to vote on anything but post offices right now is making it hard to where states who have never had to carry the banner of national security issues need to start picking it up. And we're having more of a patchwork approach, but at least we're starting to fill some of the gaps that we've seen that have made us really vulnerable to the CCP strategies.
Thanks, Candice and Simon. I really want to associate myself with the remarks that both of you have made. And I want to call out something, right? If you look around the world today and you ask yourself, why is there a war in the heart of Europe? Why is there a war in the heart of the Middle East? Why is there the potential for a war with Taiwan? And the answer is very simple in my view. This is what a world devoid of U.S. leadership looks like. When the U.S. steps back and fails to lead from the front, which we've seen, by the way, in the last 3 presidents, Republican and Democrat alike, we've seen a failure of leadership, a failure to explain to the American people why it's important to Americans for their freedom and their pocketbooks for America to lead. And this is what a world looks like. It's a world that involves the U.S. It drags us into conflict. It drags us into fights we don't want and fights we didn't choose. Rather than doing that, we ought to lead from the front. We ought to recognize that there are 4 globally repressive nations out there, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. All of them are collaborating one with another. We can see it happening in the Ukraine theater. We can see it happening with Hamas, with Syria, with Hezbollah. We can see it happening with North Korea, with China, and they are all working together, sharing information about nuclear weapons, about ballistic missiles, sharing funds on drones and the like, sharing intelligence. And until we recognize that that is the real threat, it's not just China as a potential global superpower, but it's the alliance they're building with other nations to confront us at every turn. And the more we think that the right answer to that is to step back from the world, whether that stepping back is in Ukraine or in the Middle East or in Asia, the more likely we are to get dragged into a conflict that is not our choosing, and a conflict we are more likely to lose. That is not success for America. That is not better for America's pocketbooks. That is not better for American leadership. That is not better for the American people. And as a result, the trend that we've been seeing across the board, Democrats and Republicans, of America stepping back from the world is a terrible idea. We need to lead. We need to lean forward. We need to defend our allies and oppose our enemies. When Americans are safest and our economy is strongest, when our enemies are afraid of us and our allies know that we're there. That is not America today. Every ally we have looking around the globe says, will America be there? And almost every time they say to themselves, the answer is no. Our adversaries say, will America fight us? And every time they think about it, the answer is probably not. Why? Because every time we've been confronted or had an opportunity to back our allies, at least for the last decade and a half, we have stepped away from that. We've abandoned our allies in Afghanistan. We abandoned our friends, the Kurds, who supported us and fought that war against ISIS for us. We've dipped our toe in the Ukraine waters, sending them weapons, but aren't willing to do anything to actually defend them. Israel, you can see what's happening on college campuses around this country after they suffered the equivalent of a dozen 9/11s in a single day on a population-adjusted basis. This is not American leadership, and if you're worried about chaos in the world, this is why.
I'd like to ask the panel one question, and then we'll turn to the audience. The whole question of the the defense industrial base, to those of us who are very free market, how do you draw lines there to say maybe treat China in a different manner, or maybe even the other, beyond China, some of the other states you mentioned, Jamil? What's the best way to think that one through? And leave it to all of you.
Well, I'll just tell you from a practitioner's perspective of running legislation on this. I know when I ran the bill prohibiting China and other bad actors, Russia, Iran would be included that as well, from purchasing land, people said this isn't a very free market approach to land ownership. And in this case, we have lots of competing interests and lots of competing principles, and national security, in my opinion, trumped on this one. Now, rather than there was a competing bill that would have just prohibited foreign land ownership across the board, whether they were ally or a restricted foreign entity, which went really far. But I feel like using a targeted, tailored approach and being aware of how they're using our principles against us. The fact that they can come in and buy land anywhere right next to a military installation is concerning. We have Hill Air Force Base in Utah, Dugway Proving Ground. We have a growing aerospace and defense industry. We've got Boeing, Northrop Grumman, L3 Harris, a whole host. There are lots of reasons why you would want to target Utah's land. And even right now, it's currently being paused by the courts, but next to Dugway Proving Ground, a Chinese-owned company came in to make a major land purchase, and our National Guard was like, hey, bad idea here, folks. So I think that we have to really take national security seriously. And again, unfortunately, it would be great if the federal government were to stand up something where they're actually viewing states as partners on this issue and reading them in to the issues, because unfortunately there have been decades of the CCP strategy that they've been able to go in and make those purchases. So in my opinion, this is an area where national security really was critical in making sure that our lands were protected in Utah.
Simon?
I'm generally not a big fan of government, but when it comes to dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, I think there's one thing we have to bear in mind is the Chinese Communist Party see all rule-based institution globally as an oppression against them and their global South allies. They think this rule-based system is a mechanism for keeping them poor, which is not true. So domestically, I think we can talk about like what we should do, but I think as a matter of principle, whatever we do, the rules should generally apply to all agency, like whoever that is. If we think TikTok is a national security risk, then if we require TikTok to disclose anything, we should have the same requirements to Meta, to Alphabet, to Amazon. I think that is what is a fair rule-based system. And we should take up the leadership to show the world that, hey, this is what we are doing. We are not targeting only the Communist Party, right? But in the international arena, China wants to do something that to change the rule-based system into something more arbitrary and favor them. And I think that is the real danger. A lot of things the Chinese Communist Party trying to advocate in the international arena is actually quite appealing to the progressive left. They love the ideas that, oh, let's have something to challenge the American hegemony. But at the end of the day, they don't realize that it is trying to introduce the kind of authoritarian visions to the free world. And I think that is what makes me reflect on how we should deal with China. And in the recent national security strategy paper by the White House, it says we will not attempt to change other regimes or like the ideological landscape outside of America. And I think that is the most wrong approach. We should take up the thought leadership and really confront the Beijing's version of how the international global order should be. And going back to the rule-based system, where everything is transparent and has a logic that everyone can follow. I think that is really important.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Simon and Candice said. I think a couple of things that I would say. One, I'm a big believer in free markets, right? I went to University of Chicago. I teach at George Mason, right? Like, we are free markets through and through. That being said, right, there's nothing wrong, and the idea of industrial policy is not a dirty word for conservatives. We have had industrial policy the entire history of this country. Our entire defense industry, we only buy American because, or UK because that's what we believe in. We believe in buying American for that. Our telecoms policy, the reason we are able to conduct surveillance of the globe and have such an intelligence advantage because all the telecommunications wires run through the U.S. That was not a mistake. That was very intentional. The idea of having industrial policy when it comes to core technology capabilities and the like, which is the future, there is nothing wrong with that. I think the other piece of this is, look, we can't allow ourselves to be pulled into this trap of moral equivalency, right? The idea that because we have surveillance in this country, that the Chinese should be able to have their surveillance as well, that is not the same thing. We have the rule of law here. You may not like the way it works all the time. It may not work perfectly all the time, but we have divided powers. We have separation of powers. We have an independent judiciary. Again, you might not always like how it works, but we do. The Chinese government is not like that. It is judge, jury, and executioner. When they conduct surveillance, it is not like American surveillance. And this false equivalency between Huawei and ZTE on one hand and American technology comes on the other is completely bunk. Now, I do think, like Simon says, if we're going to allow them to have the flexibility of being an American company, they have to act like an American company, right? They have to work with the U.S. government, and we have to be able to be cooperative and collaborative. It doesn't mean going and censoring content on the internet. It doesn't mean collaborating with the government when it comes to suppressing Americans' free speech. It does, however, mean when the government needs to conduct surveillance of foreigners located overseas, that's something our companies should be helping us with, not fighting us on left at every turn. At the very same time that Yahoo fought the U.S. government on surveillance of terrorists, they were collaborating with the Chinese government to give them information on dissidents in China. That is unacceptable. You want to be an American company, you want the benefit of the rule of law, then you work with us and you don't work with them.
Okay, now let's turn to the audience. We have plenty of time. David?
Yeah, hey. I have a question sort of about soft power. So it's really obvious that the CCP is fighting for influence in like low and middle income countries, and ostensibly trying to export their model of political economy to all of these like critical nations. They're doing that, I guess, with like lending competition with like the BRI, Confucius Institutes. Like I think I read that there's like 60 of those in 45 countries on the African continent. They're doing it with, also through the tech sharing stuff, like you mentioned, and they're leaning, what I see sort of as this through line, really heavily on this narrative that like we, China, are a part of the global South too, like this narrative of like solidarity, right? Like the West are the oppressors, maybe we're a little bit better off like economically than you guys, but we're like the big brother and you should all sort of work with us. And my question for you all is, what do you assess as sort of the state of play now when it comes to the United States' response to that soft power battle? And what should we be doing like more, I guess, on that front to win hearts and minds, I suppose, in the countries where China is trying to gain influence?
So our response has been a failure. We have disengaged. We've ceded Africa, for example, to the Chinese. That's a huge mistake. Not just politically, but economically, right? You think about critical minerals, you think about the capabilities and the opportunities there for markets, and the Chinese have completely taken advantage of it. That being said, it's not been an unmitigated win for the Chinese because the reality is their situation is unstable there too. The African nations and other nations around the globe are starting to realize that these loans are extortative, that the Chinese are coming in. They're not hiring local talent. They're bringing in Chinese nationals to work these things. They're building roads that are just good enough to get the minerals out and then they fall apart, right? They're recognizing the Chinese are simply exploiting them the way that they perceived, and that may have been accurate, that colonial powers exploited them in the past, right? But the fact of the matter is they still are not ready to engage with us because we're not there. we're just not present in the vast majority of these countries. Now the problem is there's a fight at home about, well, how much money do we spend overseas, right? Is there real value in our foreign aid and in USAID and the work it does and our NDI and IRI and democracy promotion? Is there real value, or is that just a waste of money down the tubes? And the real question is, how do you spend that money effectively? BRI, for all of its problems, has been a very effective tool for the Chinese until now, as people are starting to realize the problem. As they realize the problem, though, there's an opportunity for us to step in. The question is, given our own political challenges at home and the debates over how much money we spend overseas and whether we ought to continue to do that and expand that, right? It seems unlikely that either party is going to lean forward on that front at a very moment when the Chinese are opening the door because people are realizing the extortive nature of their policies for us to come back in and regain the territory we've lost.
I agree with everything you said. And I would also add, I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time. So with that, I'd also add, we need to get our house in order. I mean, the fact that we still have Confucius Institutes operating across our country in our university settings is incredibly concerning. If you think about defense contractors who contract out with universities, they've completely opened themselves up to a vulnerability when those universities are hosting a Confucius Institute. Also in this Confucius classroom, again, I'll use Utah as an example, they weren't teaching major issues and points of history and China's history because they were sanitizing the curriculum, right? And then we are raising a generation of students who think, man, China's a great place. And I think what was frustrating for me, I'll be honest, was it took a couple years. If you go back and look at the bills I ran, it took a couple years to get the movement on them because people were like, why should we care? Like, this doesn't impact me at all. And we need to help our citizenry understand this is a major national security issue for America, and we need to be proud of our American values and what separates us from it. I'll tell you, I had someone say, this is really racist of you that you're running these bills. And I said, if you love the Chinese people, you hate the Chinese Communist Party because they are the first in the line of people who are being oppressed by them. And I think we have to take control of the messaging. Honestly, there are too many students, and I teach at UVU as an adjunct professor, who just take what is fed to them on TikTok or what they see online and as gospel truth. I think we need media literacy for our citizenry. We have to be able to critically think again and say, this seems off, right? So anyways, I think the Chinese Communist Party, to their credit, has done a great job undermining us at home. And if we need a generation to rise up and push back and promote with soft power across the world American values, you've got to have people who believe it. And they've already started it and have historically been undermining us on that front.
Quick answer is we have to do a better job. If you look at the 80s, what really changed people's mind in behind the Iron Curtains are not like ideology or Hayek or whatever, it's Pepsi Cola. When people have these nice consumer goods, then they think, hey, maybe the world is much better outside. And of course, China now is no longer the kind of backward economy like it was, but there are a lot of things that they are not allowed to do in China. Whatever the Chinese Communist Party tries to ban, we should get them across and let people to enjoy free information. And like we used to have a lot of Hollywood productions that really captures the minds of people, but look at what is going on now with Disney and all this politically correct thing, and people even laugh at it. Even Chinese people say, what is going on with California, with the, like, people in LA? What are they doing? I think we have to look at what is going on at home, and I think a lot of, like, we actually diminished our influence through our own constraint on ourselves.
Thank you. I'm Wes with the Heritage Foundation. Candice, thank you for your leadership in Utah. Would you mind sharing more on your perspective on the role of states in national security? In Montana's TikTok litigation, one of the leading net choice arguments is that national security should be, left to the federal government. What should and should not be preempted by the federal government?
Great question. I will tell you, there are a lot of things that the federal government's supposed to be taking care of right now. Border security, one of them, right? Like, you could list a whole host of things that they're completely dropping the ball on. And so that's where I think states more and more are having to pick up the mess because it's starting to impact us negatively. So my answers probably evolved over the years of working on this, where I thought, okay, we clean up our universities, we clean up our education setting, we're good. But then as I've looked and seen more and more of what the Chinese Communist Party has done in their strategy to undermine Congress and go straight at the state level, we need to do a heck of a lot more to empower our states and stand up basically a shield that the federal government isn't doing. So a couple other things that I'll be working on is, as I talked about, the transparency and disclosures of trips, but also making it to where we're not purchasing vehicles that were made by forced labor. I just talked to the woman who manages our fleet, and she said, yeah, Congress passed, the Uyghur Labor Prevention Act, Forced Labor Act. We can't buy anything right now. There's nothing on the market. And I said, well, we're going to reinforce it at the state level and include all products that go through those provinces. We're also looking at vulnerabilities we have with infrastructure like Texas has done, and telecommunications, and there are a lot of things we can be doing. And again, yes, this is what the federal government's supposed to be doing, but they're not. And so we can sit on our hands and say, oh, I'm sure they're going to come around someday, but that's not going to happen. So I think that states more and more have to step into this space. And we, unfortunately, like I said, we're playing whack-a-mole right now. We're being very reactive to what has already happened on U.S. soil. But I'm hoping that we get to a place where we're in a more proactive setting and able to fortify our country. Even if it's just from a state-by-state basis, we'll push them out if Congress isn't willing to do it for us.
Good afternoon. I'm Kaylee Aquino from Grassroots Institute in Hawaii. Simon, I've got a question for you. I really appreciate the tension you've talked about in terms of being balanced between the way we might react and perhaps the way we shouldn't react to the China threat. You've made an interesting comment when you started off. In fighting totalitarianism, we might find ourselves becoming totalitarian. Could you explain in what way that could be?
Sometimes we see everything as a threat, and that is exactly the mentality of the CCP. Say, for example, on the issue of national security, do we believe that people are unwillingly or unknowingly sacrificing their own freedom for advancing some other authoritarian regime's goal? Probably not, but when you have all these stringent, restrictive rules imposed from the top, from the federal government, from whoever, eventually these restrictions will be abused for other purposes. That is what I'm worried about. I think the most important thing is to let everyone knows what is at stake. That is their own freedom, whether it be threatened by a regime across the Pacific Ocean or the regime somewhere nearby. They are the same to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's one other piece to it, which is the way a totalitarian regime succeeds is by attacking and undermining the rule of law. And we have seen in the last decade and a half, across multiple parties, across multiple presidents, an attack in this country on the rule of law, on our core national security institutions, on our rule of law institutions. No doubt there are deep problems at the FBI, at the Justice Department, in the intelligence community. But undermining those in public, undermining those and saying, I'm going to listen to Vladimir Putin and not my own intelligence community in public before the world, is on the path to totalitarianism. And that happened in my party, with the president of my party. That is unacceptable. That can never happen in this country. And that's what we've seen, and it's happened consistently, president after president, administration after administration. We cannot accept that. We have to stand against that, regardless of who the party in power is, regardless of who the president is. When we see efforts like that to undermine the rule of law of this country, regardless of who does it, we, as conservatives, have to call that out.
Hi. Thanks all for being here. So my question is the Chinese Cold War. I've heard it described as a hot piece as well, in the sense that when we had a Cold War with Russia, we were economically distinct, we were ideologically distinct, whereas our federal apparatus and China's federal apparatus are not as distinct as I would like them to be, and our economies are fully dependent on each other. So how do we navigate this when our government employees' pension funds are in Chinese missile tech? And, you know, there are complexity upon complexity upon complexity where a Chinese factory is in a congressman's or congresswoman's district. And so employment, et cetera, right? So I'm just wondering, how do we step through this as a people? I mean, what are we supposed to do to even have the beginnings of a national front like we had against communism, during the first Cold War?
I think, again, it starts with education and conversation in our business community. I know when I started running some of my bills, they said, oh my gosh, this is going to wreak havoc on our business. I just met with World Trade Center on the other bills that I've had, and they said, oh my gosh, China's going to make all these threats. And I said, have they done any of them? Like, we've passed all these bills. What's been the fallout? None, right? But I also think part of it is having our business community be in on the conversation as well. And I think during the Cold War, right, if you would have done business with a Russian company, it would not have worked. We're so coupled, though, together, it does make it difficult. I think, though, decoupling, de-risking, right, those are the hip words of pulling back, finding alternatives, working with Taiwan, working with other players, working with India, finding other partners that we can work with, and encouraging businesses to do so is really helpful. I think, again, what has been concerning is so many people, for whatever reason, and this is to the CCP's credit, they don't view this as our problem, right? And even during COVID-19, right, we had some crazy things happen in our country. I was meeting with some students, and one young woman said, why can't we be like China? Everyone's at their house right now. No one's leaving on the streets. And I was like, that's because there's a guy with a gun outside their apartment keeping them in there. So we live in a free society. But it was baffling to me that there was such a glorification. Our teacher had talked about how great China's COVID policies were. So I guess I keep coming back to education. I think it goes for our business leaders too, in raising awareness that, yeah, if you're going to do business with China, do so with your eyes wide open and know what that means when you shake their hand and all the data and privacy laws that on their end you're now exposing your customers to. So I just think, again, sometimes in our intelligence community, we do a great job of keeping things so secret that it's like no one knows. I'm not asking for a classified briefing. An unclassified briefing just highlighting the strategies of the CCP would be really helpful. You can invite business leaders to it to say, hey, these are some vulnerabilities you should be aware of. You talk about trade shows. I know, for example, in Utah, there's a Department of Agriculture. Our department hosted a trade show, and we had some Chinese businessmen come through. And this company was so excited to share their product. They asked, hey, can I get a sample of your product? Oh, yeah, sure thing. We're so excited you might be an investor. Boom. It's on the market, recreated in China. They took it home and replicated it, right? So sometimes in our kindness and naivety, we end up opening ourselves up to a whole bunch of hurt.
Totally agree with Candice on the part about education. At the end of the day, if there's one thing that makes America different, it is really about our education system, especially the higher education system. When people ask, hey, China and the United States look very similar in a lot of aspects, but there's one thing that I think that really set us apart. That is our independent higher education institution. But I have to add that it is changing. It is becoming, infested by a lot of useful idiots, so to speak. They want to make America like China. Just like people who think like COVID policy in China is great, but fortunately, it seems those people are not really having real immediate impact yet. But who knows down the road what would happen? But the good news also is, I think there is an implosion going on in China. They even have a word for it. I just recently learned, infolution. So it is like becoming more inward and try to isolate itself from the world. It is not the United States trying to decouple from China. It is China trying to decouple from the rest of the world. So I have a contrarian way of looking at it. We should really engage, not the Chinese Communist Party, but every Chinese that is abroad and overseas. Let them see for themselves what is going on back at home, and let them decide whether they want to see China to become more inward looking, or they will never be able to go back. This is what a lot of overseas Chinese, they don't want.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great example of one of the challenges we face, right? Which is that the United States has historically brought a lot of people here to be educated, and then we send them back home. Go build your companies abroad. Go back to China and use that capability, right? That is crazy, right? 60% of America's top companies, most evolutionary companies, were built by immigrants who came here to study and then stayed here for the American dream, right? The idea that we push people back home to China or wherever it might be is insane, right? Now, having a debate about immigration today on Capitol Hill is ludicrous, right? It's not going to happen, right? But the reality is that's the conversation we need to be having, and we need to be getting people to invest in the American dream, not pushing them overseas. Now, there's national security implications. We have to do proper vetting and the like, but this is something we're capable of doing and something we haven't effectively done. It's also important to note that buying t-shirts from China is not like buying semiconductors, right? We can decouple in a way that's smart, in a way that's effective. We don't need to completely disaggregate our economies, right? If war happens and we can't get t-shirts, the world doesn't come to an end. But if we're relying upon them for pharmaceutical precursors, right? PPE, core chips, that's a real problem. And the biggest stumbling block to really effectively decoupling from China is not China, it's ourselves, and more importantly, it's our European allies who don't see China as a problem, but see us as the problem. We're internally at war across the Atlantic instead of making common cause, right? And it's not our fault, to be candid, right? They just don't see the threat, just like they didn't see the threat from Russia and got addicted to Russian natural gas. They're addicted to cheap Chinese goods, as we have become. We're finally starting to see that threat. They still don't see it yet. We need to get our European allies on board. And if they're not willing to do it, then get our Southeastern Asian allies on board and really make common cause with them. We can't do this alone, but if we remain separated, we won't succeed.
Thanks. My name is Mike Mitchell. I'm the executive director of No One Left Behind. We focus on U.S. allies that served in Afghanistan and Iraq. And my question is for Jamil. Your critique was a really good one about how the U.S. isn't leading in the world. But my question is, like, it feels like the politicians on, like those running for the nomination right now, I mean, they're listening to American people. So I agree with your analysis, but I guess my question is, what do those leaders need to do to get the American people to see that it's in our self-interest to lead in the world when they can't see that now? Like, what needs to change? And I'd ask that to all of you.
Yeah. It's a great question, and one I've spent a lot of time thinking about. First of all, let me thank you for your work. I mean, we have people in Afghanistan who American men and women, American soldiers, made personal promises to on behalf of our government, promises they were authorized to make, saying, I will take care of you. You work with us. We will make sure you are not left behind to the depredations of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And on that day when we left, pathetically, leaving tens of thousands of those people who stood by us when it was not easy to do so, putting themselves and their families on the line, are now left behind to the depredations of the Taliban. It is pathetic. It is embarrassing. It is a national shame. And thank you for the work that you're doing on that front. Now, the thing that the American people, it's not that Americans don't want us to engage in the world. It's not the American public doesn't want us to lead. It's that they don't understand why it's important. They have not had a politician in this country since President Bush, and he was called to it because he was a war president on a war brought to us by the adversary, right? And they have not been explained why it matters. Barack Obama didn't do it, Donald Trump didn't do it, and Joe Biden certainly hasn't done it. They need to understand why we need to lead. We are a city on a hill. We are called to this mission, frankly, by our history. It is America's role in the world to lead. It has been since the day we were founded. We were founded on an ideal that no other country believed in and no other country could have pulled off. And we've done it successfully for 200 years, and we can lead the world into a future that is free and open and economically successful for all of us, but we have to believe in America. Children today aren't raised believe in America. It's happening in our schools. They believe in something else. That is not America. They don't believe in American exceptionalism. They don't believe we're called to lead, and yet that is who we are, and we need a president. And there's not one in the current leadership of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party yet who's saying that. I'm hoping there might be one in the primaries, but right now it doesn't look like that's going to happen. So maybe we have to wait another presidential cycle for this to happen. But America is safer and more economically successful, and the American people are better off when we lead, and the American people simply need to be educated on why that matters and why it matters to their bottom line and why supporting our allies helps us in the long run. Throwing them under the bus and embarrassing ourselves the way we did in Afghanistan will never help us succeed globally.
I think too, helping people see that it's not an isolated incident. I went to Taiwan this summer, and we met with their new department who's over basically fighting misinformation. But they said that after our terrible withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Taiwanese people were dumped with social media that said Afghanistan today, Taiwan tomorrow. Then you can't trust America. And it was really powerful to me to hear that, because the direct line that was drawn for them, and they said that, within the population there was this buzz of, yeah, we just saw America's promises are crap, right? And so for me, I think obviously there's things at the national level we can do with leadership, but I think when we talk about this, we have been fighting a global war on terror since I was in the 4th grade, right? And I think there's a bit of fatigue from Americans and trying to paint a picture of what victory looks like, right? At the beginning after 9/11, we were hell-bent on we were going in, and then after a while, which we needed to be there, but I think Americans were like, what's the objective here, right? Are we eradicating terrorism? What do we need to do? With Russia, with the CCP, I think you need a leader who's going to spell out, this is our objective. This is what we're looking to do. This is what victory looks like for us. And I think that's where you'll get more support from people. I also think you have to explain, well, we were fighting the global war on terror. Russia and China, the CCP, were keeping their eye focused on the U.S. And they have been able to develop technology and upscale to us. We used to be able to show up and be like, we're the big kid on block. You have a grenade launcher from your shoulder. We outnumber you in power and people. But if you look at the technology of the CCP and what they've been able to scale up, it's concerning that we no longer are going to have this edge on any of our enemies. And we have to be aware of that. And I don't know what it's going to take with World War II. We call it the greatest generation. We need a generation that's willing to take up the banner of American leadership again if we're going to get this back on track.
I'm sorry.
Just a really quick one. Cold War, by definition, is a war that cannot be won. The only thing that ended the last one was actually through private enterprise, like self-interest, that through the free market, actually people's mind change. I think that is, at the end of the day, we have to think about that. America at its best was when we have a functioning private enterprise that is exporting our values overseas.
We only have a little more than a minute. I thought I could take the moderator's prerogative and ask Simon a specific question, given you're from Hong Kong. Taiwan, we haven't really discussed Taiwan yet. What kind of advice would you offer with respect to what kind of position the United States should be in vis-a-vis Taiwan?
Taiwan is the proof that ethnic Chinese can live in a democratic free society, so we have to defend it.
That's great. Thank you. Someone can ask a really quick question. We have 40 seconds. Yes, sir. Heritage Foundation gets number 2.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. All right, really fast. Mr. Jaffer, if our economy will take let's say a 30% hit for losing consumer goods manufacturing in China, even without critical technologies, doesn't this economic influence present a national security threat by its native incentives?
Yes.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.